The child's heart began beating again, 60 years after it had been removed from the body. Dr. Helena Werner froze in place, her gloved hands trembling as she stared at the impossible sight before her. The preserved organ, suspended in yellowish fluid inside a glass jar labeled with faded German text, pulsed rhythmically as if it had never stopped. This wasn't just scientifically impossible, it was a nightmare unfolding in real time at the University of Berlin's forensic archives. Helena's assistant collapsed to the floor, his body making a dull thud against the laboratory tiles. The security camera captured his fall, along with Helena's horrified expression as she backed away from the specimen. But the camera couldn't record the soft, unmistakable sound that filled the room, the wet, squishing noise of muscle contractions as the heart continued to beat steadily inside its chemical bath. Dr. Helena Werner wasn't just any medical examiner. She was one of Germany's most respected forensic pathologists, with 27 years of experience examining human remains. A specialist in historical cases and preserved specimens, she had been tasked with cataloging and analyzing the recently discovered collection of medical artifacts from a sealed Nazi laboratory found beneath an abandoned hospital in northern Bavaria. The collection had remained untouched since 1945, sealed behind a false wall that construction workers had only discovered during renovation 3 weeks earlier. The preserved organs were part of a larger collection of medical specimens, detailed notebooks, and photographic slides that bore the unmistakable stamp of Nazi medical experimentation. Helena had examined hundreds of historical specimens throughout her career, but nothing had prepared her for what she discovered in this particular collection. "I've never seen preservation of this quality," she would later tell investigators, her voice still shaking during the recorded interview. The tissue showed no signs of degradation, despite being over 60 years old. It was as if they had been removed yesterday. But the freshness of the specimens was only the beginning of the horror. The heart belonged to a child, approximately 8 years old, according to the meticulous German notes accompanying the specimen. The label identified the subject only as Test Subject 9C, with a date, February 12, 1943. There were dozens of similar jars, each containing perfectly preserved human organs, kidneys, lungs, sections of brain tissue, and even entire small intestines, all labeled with different subject numbers and dates. What made Helena's blood run cold wasn't just the content of the collection, but the impossible condition of the specimens. These weren't merely well preserved, they looked alive. The tissues maintained their natural color. Blood vessels remained intact and clearly visible. There was no clouding of the preservation fluid, no tissue breakdown, and most disturbing of all, no cellular death detectable under microscopic examination. "The cells are still metabolizing," Helena whispered into her recorder, disbelief evident in her voice. "That's not possible. That's simply not possible." Yet the evidence before her eyes defied everything she knew about biology and death. And then, as if to mock the very laws of nature, the heart had begun to beat. When Helena's assistant, Thomas Keller, regained consciousness, his first words were, "Did I imagine it? Tell me I imagined it." Helena couldn't offer him that comfort. Instead, she pointed to the jar where the heart continued its rhythmic contractions, slower now, but still unmistakably active. Thomas vomited immediately, splattering the pristine lab floor with his lunch. Helena couldn't blame him. She had come close to doing the same. The two scientists weren't alone in the lab for long. Within 30 minutes, the room was filled with university officials, additional medical experts, and eventually government representatives. News of the impossible discovery had traveled quickly through channels that were supposedly secure. By evening, the entire collection had been confiscated by the German government and transferred to a military facility outside Berlin. But what the authorities didn't know, what Helena hadn't yet told them, was what she had discovered in the accompanying documentation just minutes before the heart began to beat. The notebooks accompanying the specimens contained detailed records of the experiments conducted by a Dr. Friedrich Weiss, an SS physician whose name didn't appear in any of the known records of Nazi medical personnel. His notes described a series of experiments focused not on the typical eugenic pursuits of the Third Reich, but on something far more disturbing: the preservation of human consciousness after death. The soul, or consciousness, does not immediately depart the body upon clinical death, one passage read. It lingers within the cells, particularly those of the major organs. With the correct chemical treatment, this essence can be preserved indefinitely, perhaps even transferred. Helena had initially dismissed this as pseudoscientific nonsense, the kind of mystical thinking that often infected Nazi scientific endeavors. But the beating heart forced her to reconsider. The preservation fluid itself was another mystery. Analysis revealed a complex mixture of chemicals, many of which were familiar preservatives, like formaldehyde and alcohol. But there were other compounds that defied identification, organic molecules with structures unlike anything in modern chemical databases. Whatever this solution was, it wasn't made with 1940s technology. The fluid contains compounds with molecular structures we can't identify, reported Dr. Klaus Hoffmann, a leading biochemist called in to analyze the solution. Some appear to be organic in nature, but with atomic arrangements that shouldn't be stable. It's as if the laws of chemistry were different when this was created. But the beating heart wasn't the only impossible phenomenon observed in the lab that day. As researchers continued to examine the collection, more disturbing events occurred. A preserved section of brain tissue showed electrical activity when placed near monitoring equipment. A pair of lungs in their jar began to expand and contract slightly, as if attempting to breathe. And most disturbing of all, a complete larynx preserved in a larger container emitted a sound, a faint, high-pitched humming that those present would later describe as almost like a child trying to sing. Thomas Keller never returned to the laboratory after that first day. He checked himself into a psychiatric facility 3 days later, suffering from acute insomnia and persistent auditory hallucinations. "I can still hear it," he told his doctors. "That humming, it's trying to form words." Helena Werner continued her examination of the documentation, working now under military supervision in a secure facility. The government had classified the entire incident at the highest level of secrecy, but rumors had already begun to spread through scientific communities. There was talk of Nazi zombie research and immortality experiments, most of which was dismissed as sensationalist nonsense. The truth, as Helena discovered, was far worse than the rumors. Dr. Weiss hadn't been working alone. His notebooks referenced a team of researchers and collaboration with specialists from the Eastern Program. Pages of notes included strange symbols alongside the German text, characters that linguists later identified as a form of ancient Sanskrit mixed with mathematical notations. Whatever Weiss had been pursuing, it went beyond conventional science. They weren't trying to preserve life, Helena explained to the small committee of government officials assembled to hear her findings. They were trying to preserve something beyond life, something they believed resided within the physical body but was separate from it. The committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Helena continued. Based on these notes, they believed they had succeeded with at least 3 subjects. The specimens we found were part of what they called the successful cohort, children whose essence had been preserved in a state of awareness. One official interrupted, his face pale. "Are you suggesting these organs are conscious? That they're aware of their condition?" Helena hesitated before answering. "I'm suggesting that the researchers believed they were. And given what we've observed, I can't dismiss the possibility. The implications were too horrific to fully process. If the Nazi researchers had indeed found a way to preserve consciousness within dismembered organs, these children had been aware, on some level, for over 60 years, trapped in a state of disembodied horror with no way to communicate or escape. But the mystery only deepened as Helena continued her investigation. The dates in Weiss's notebooks extended beyond Germany's surrender in 1945. The final entry was dated September 3, 1947, more than 2 years after the war had ended. "The Americans have agreed to continue funding under Operation Paperclip," the entry read, "transferring the laboratory to a more secure location next week. The children remain stable. Subject 12 shows the most promise for the next phase." Helena's blood ran cold as she read these words. Operation Paperclip was the known American program that recruited German scientists after World War II, offering them immunity in exchange for their knowledge. But the official records made no mention of Weiss or his research. The discovery suggested something far more sinister, that the most disturbing aspects of Nazi medical research hadn't ended with the war, but had continued under new management, and possibly continued to this day. When Helena presented this information to the committee, the room fell silent. Then, without explanation, she was removed from the investigation. The collection disappeared from official records. The laboratory where she had made her discovery was cleaned and repurposed within a week. It was as if the entire incident had never happened. Except for one thing. The dreams began. Helena started experiencing vivid nightmares featuring children she had never met. They spoke to her in German, describing horrific procedures performed on their bodies. They showed her their removed organs, held them out to her with small, trembling hands. "Help us," they whispered. "We're still here. We've always been here." She began keeping a journal of these dreams, documenting names and details that the children shared with her. In one particularly vivid nightmare, a young girl with dark hair told Helena her name was Elise Hoffmann, and that she had been taken from an orphanage in Munich in 1942. When Helena later researched the name, she discovered records of an Elise Hoffmann who had indeed disappeared from a Munich orphanage during that year. The official record listed her as transferred to state care, a common euphemism for children selected for Nazi medical experiments. Helena contacted other researchers who had briefly been involved with the collection before it was confiscated. 5 out of 7 reported similar dreams. Thomas Keller, still institutionalized, had covered the walls of his room with drawings of children holding their own organs, accompanied by writing in what appeared to be perfect German, a language he had never studied or spoken. The dreams were eerily consistent across different researchers. Each reported seeing the same children, despite never having discussed their experiences with each other. Each described the same laboratory setting, a room with pale green tiles and strange brass instruments lining the walls. And each recalled the same terrible detail. The children in their dreams could feel everything that happened to their disembodied organs, even decades later. They described sensation, one researcher wrote in her private journal. They could feel the touch of the forceps on their hearts. They could feel the cold of the preservation fluid. And they could feel the passage of time, 60 years of darkness and cold, unable to scream. Helena began searching for records of the missing children. She discovered a pattern. Between 1941 and 1943, over 100 children had vanished from orphanages and institutions across German-occupied Europe. The records showed the same designation, transferred to state care. But unlike most victims of Nazi medical experimentation, no remains or death certificates had ever been found for these children. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, except for their organs, preserved in jars, somehow still metabolizing, still active, possibly still conscious. 6 months after the initial discovery, Helena was approached by an elderly man who identified himself only as David. He claimed to have been a junior assistant at a research facility in New Mexico in the 1950s, where he had witnessed similar preserved specimens being studied by American scientists working alongside German researchers. They weren't trying to preserve life, he told her, unknowingly echoing her own words. They were trying to capture the soul, to learn how to transfer consciousness from one vessel to another. According to David, the American military had been particularly interested in the potential applications of Weiss's research. They talked about creating the perfect soldier, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. One whose consciousness could be preserved after death, even transferred to a new body if necessary. A soldier who couldn't truly die. David pulled a yellowed photograph from his wallet. It showed a laboratory not unlike the one from the researcher's dreams. Pale green tiles, brass instruments lining the walls. And in the center, a row of glass containers, each holding what appeared to be a human organ. "I took this in '54, David said, "before they caught me and threw me out. They told me if I ever spoke about it, they'd know. They'd always know. David died in a car accident 3 days after their meeting. Police ruled it a tragic case of drunk driving, despite the fact that David's medical records indicated he hadn't consumed alcohol in over 20 years due to a liver condition. Helena began to fear for her own safety. She copied her notes and research, sending packages to trusted colleagues around the world with instructions to release the information if anything happened to her. Then she disappeared. Her abandoned apartment told a disturbing story. Books on consciousness research and quantum physics lay open on her desk. Her computer contained thousands of pages of notes and theories, many becoming increasingly paranoid in tone. On the walls of her bedroom, she had pinned dozens of drawings similar to those made by Thomas Keller, children holding their own organs, surrounded by strange symbols. The most disturbing discovery was made in her bathroom. In the tub was a large glass jar filled with a yellowish fluid that matched the description of the preservation fluid from the Nazi specimens. The jar was empty, but residue analysis showed traces of organic material, human tissue, though the specific organ couldn't be identified. For 2 years, nothing was heard from Dr. Helena Werner. Her colleagues assumed she had suffered a breakdown, or perhaps had been silenced by government forces wanting to keep the discovery secret. But then, the packages began to arrive. Recipients around the world, scientists, journalists, and human rights lawyers, received identical packages containing Helena's notes, along with new information she had apparently gathered during her disappearance. The notes detailed a network of continuing research stretching from the 1940s to the present day, involving laboratories in the United States, Argentina, and more recently, facilities in Eastern Europe. Most disturbing of all, Helena's final notes suggested that the research had advanced far beyond preserved organs. They succeeded in transferring consciousness, she wrote, first into other organic vessels, then into engineered biological containers, and now they're attempting to move beyond biology entirely. The children were just the beginning. God help us all when they perfect the process. Accompanying these notes were detailed schematics of what appeared to be human-like synthetic bodies, with handwritten annotations describing them as vessels for transplanted consciousness. There were photographs of laboratory facilities with dates as recent as the previous year. And there were records, hundreds of them, of missing children from around the world, their disappearances spanning decades. The pattern never stopped, Helena wrote. They never stopped taking children, each one selected for specific neurological characteristics, each one processed the same way. The original Nazi protocols refined over generations. The packages included coordinates for a facility in the mountains of Colorado, along with access codes and instructions for navigating its security systems. The evidence is there, Helena wrote. The children are there, still alive, still aware, still waiting for someone to free them from their prison. The most unsettling inclusion in the packages was a small vial of yellowish fluid, identical to the preservation solution from the Nazi specimens. Analysis revealed the same unidentifiable compounds, the same impossible chemical structures, and in some cases, the fluid appeared to move on its own, pulsing rhythmically inside the sealed vial. International journalists converged on the coordinates, finding nothing but an abandoned weather station. Government officials dismissed Helena's claims as the delusions of a troubled mind. Her reputation was systematically destroyed through leaked psychological evaluations suggesting she had suffered a psychotic break. Yet, questions remained. Multiple recipients reported that the packages containing Helena's research emanated a strange humming sound when opened, a high-pitched noise almost like a child trying to sing. Several described having vivid dreams after handling the materials, dreams of children asking for help. One journalist who had received a package traveled to Argentina following leads in Helena's notes. He disappeared for 3 weeks, then reappeared with no memory of where he had been. His body showed signs of surgical procedures, small, precise scars at the base of his skull and along his spine. Brain scans revealed unusual activity in regions associated with memory and consciousness. When questioned under hypnosis, he spoke in fluent German, a language he had never learned, and identified himself as Subject 17. He described being transferred multiple times. His consciousness moved from one container to another. He begged to be returned to the fluid, claiming his current body felt wrong, felt foreign. 3 days after these sessions, the journalist committed suicide, leaving behind a note written in childish handwriting, "I want to go home. Please let me go home." And then there were the photographs included in Helena's packages, images of preserved organs floating in yellowish fluid, their tissues impossibly fresh and vital. And in one photograph, clearly visible despite the government's insistence that the image had been digitally altered, a small heart, suspended in its glass prison, caught in the moment of contraction, beating against all possibilities, against nature itself, against time. The most recent development came 6 months ago, when a night security guard at a medical research facility in Switzerland reported hearing children's voices coming from a secure storage area. When investigators arrived, they found the guard unconscious, surrounded by broken glass and spilled preservation fluid. The facility claimed that only conventional specimens were stored there, and that the guard had suffered a psychotic episode. But leaked security footage showed something else. Dozens of glass containers shattering simultaneously, their contents spilling across the floor. And in the fluid, organs, hearts, lungs, brains, all moving, all active, all alive in ways that violated everything we understand about death and decay. The guard, upon regaining consciousness, reported the same dream that had haunted Helena Werner and the others. Children asking for help, showing him their removed organs, speaking in languages he didn't understand. Helena Werner has never been found. The preserved Nazi specimens have never been acknowledged by official sources. The children, if they still exist in some impossible state of preserved consciousness, remain hidden from the world. But sometimes, researchers working late in medical laboratories around the world report hearing a faint sound, like distant singing. And medical students occasionally wake from vivid dreams of children speaking to them in languages they don't understand, showing them their own removed organs with small, pleading hands. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from transplant recipients, people who have received donor organs from unknown sources. Some describe experiencing memories that aren't their own. Others report dreaming of laboratories with pale green tiles and brass instruments lining the walls. A few claim to hear voices, children's voices, whispering inside their bodies. "They're still using us," one transplant recipient told his psychiatrist before disappearing from his hospital bed. "The experiments never ended. We're still here, trapped inside. Please find the others. Tell them we're still alive." Are the preserved souls of these children still trapped in their disembodied state, trying to communicate across the boundaries of conventional science? Did Nazi researchers discover something about human consciousness that defies our understanding of life and death? And perhaps most disturbing of all, did this research continue under new management, evolving into something even more sinister than its origins? I leave these questions for you to consider. If you've ever felt an inexplicable chill in a hospital corridor or sensed something watching you from specimen jars in a medical laboratory, perhaps you've brushed against this hidden history. Perhaps the children have tried to reach you too. What would you do if you found evidence of such research continuing today? Would you have the courage to investigate, knowing what happened to Helena Werner and others who came too close to the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've ever experienced dreams of unknown children showing you their organs, or heard humming sounds from medical specimens, perhaps it would be better to keep that information to yourself. Some forms of attention are dangerous to attract. Subscribe to our channel for more disturbing historical mysteries that the world has tried to forget. The truth remains preserved, waiting for someone brave enough to face it.